Thank you all for coming out on, as Lynette said, on this terrible night. I thought nobody will be here, even if you have got tickets, but I'm very impressed. That's Dunedin for you, no doubt. I'm going to talk mainly about my latest book, Skylark, and I'll talk a little bit about it, and then I'll read a piece from it, and there might be a few other things happen. We'll see how it goes. As Lynette said, this book is about the early performers who came to New Zealand. So in most of my other books, I've set the story in a particular place, like on Denniston for the two Denniston Rose, and up the Wanganui River for the Wanganui one landings, and partly in Scandinavia on the Faroe Islands, and partly in the Wairarapa, not the Wairarapa, the Horowhenua for the Scandinavian book. But this one is not set in any particular place in New Zealand, because the early performers who came were travellers. They travelled from here to there. They were tough old people and moved all around the country. So this book is set all around the country where they travelled to. They loved going to the goldfields because there was always a good audience in the goldfields, and so the goldfields come into this book too. And I'll tell you a bit about the real characters that are in my book soon. I suppose this is a novel that's been waiting to happen because my family, both my parents, Don and Tim Priestley, were theatre people. This was in the days before there was professional theatre, but in Wellington they were very involved in theatre, both as actors and directors, and my mum wrote plays too. And so I grew up, my sister and I grew up scrambling around under the seats of various theatres while my parents were either acting or directing, and as soon as we were able to string a few sentences together, we were on stage too, if ever there was a child needed. My dad was in radio drama too, so we often did radio drama bits for children's voices. In fact, I think one of my earliest actual earning job, I earned money for it, was as a child about this high on 2ZB, as it was in those days, it was the commercial radio station, and I was advertising Marmite, and I had to say the line, "My mum always puts Marmite in our soups and stews," so that was what I had to say, and I got it wrong twice, and I called it Mimite instead of Marmite, and the man who was recording this advertisement got quite annoyed with me, because in those days, I mean nowadays of course you just wipe it, but in those days everything was cut onto a big disc, about as big as that, you know, great big ceramic, or I don't know what it was, vinyl or before vinyl, a disc. Anyway, so he took this disc up and lifted it up and smashed it on the ground and said, "That's what you've done, you've ruined this whole disc by saying Mimite, now say Marmite next time." So I got it right next time. But, so it was in our family, and when I was a young woman I acted and directed and made props backstage and all those kind of things, and my sister was a professional actor, and my son is an artist who works in TV and film art department, and one of my great nieces is quite well known TV actress, Tundi Wright, up in Auckland. So it's in the family, let's say, performance, and my husband, who's here tonight, Lawton, is a musician, and together, before I ever got into writing novels for adults, Lawton and I have written a lot of shows for children and songs for children that your children, or maybe looking at the grey hairs, grandchildren, probably sing them in schools. There are a lot of songs. In fact, there's one of our shows that we've written, there's a national touring company called Capital E, National Children's Theatre, is touring a new show that we just wrote last year called Around the World and Back Again, which is a show about dogs. The four characters in the play are all dogs, and Lawton's written all the music and the songs, and I've written the show and the words of the songs. I don't know whether it's come to Dunedin or it's on its way, but it's touring New Zealand at the moment, so keep your eye out for it. It's quite funny. Your grandchildren or your children would enjoy it. Ours didn't. So that was why I wanted to write about our early entertainers. And when I started researching for it and reading up about the early entertainers, I was astonished to find how early they came to New Zealand. That we think of our early ancestors when they first came here in the 1840s and 50s as nitty-gritty, getting their hands and their work down to the grindstone, and not taking much attention to performance or going to the theatre or anything like that, or even putting on shows, but that was not the case at all. Right from the very earliest days, there were people acting, some of them, a lot of them amateur, but there were professional ones too. I found that there was a circus that came to New Zealand in 1850. Can you believe that? I mean, there were no roads connecting the main towns and the main settlements, but here was the circus that came across by boat from Australia with all its paraphernalia, and it did a little season. It came to Dunedin. It did a season in Nelson and in Wanganui and in Napier and in Auckland and in Wellington and in Christchurch. So every time it would have had to get all its animals. They had horses, a lot of horses. It was largely equestrian. It was Foley's Royal Victorian Circus to start with, and then Foley's American Circus, and then, but it was always Foley's Circus. And Bill Foley was the manager of it, and he was a clown and also a brilliant equestrian. He had a horse called Lucy, who he could make Lucy do just anything. Like we've been watching the dressage, I kept thinking, yeah, I bet Lucy could do just as well. It sounded like that from the reviews, the ecstatic reviews that you can read in the very early newspapers. And he had his own horse, and he had a pair of ponies that Madame Tournier rode on, one foot on each, were pirouetting and waving a parasol. He had a pair of zebras that he boasted were the only domesticated zebras in the world, that he could train them to do things. I don't know whether that was true or not. He had a two-headed goat and an orangutan, and he put these on a coastal steamer or a coastal trading sailboat and went from town to town around New Zealand. He had Mr. Rossiter on the hired wire and Master Bird on the slack wire. I wasn't quite sure what the slack wire was until I found an advertisement for Foley's Victoria Circus. That's the advertisement, and that will be Mr. Bird on the slack wire. It looks very painful, really. But all these people, whenever I read of something that was interesting, like Foley's Circus, I thought, right, I'm going to have that in my book. And I cherry-picked all the exciting and interesting bits. Mr. Foley was married to Mrs. W.H. Foley. Nobody so far knows what her name was. She was just Mrs. W.H. Foley. And she sang in the circus, but she also was an actor, an actress, an artiste, she would have called herself. She did call herself an artiste, and quite often she left the circus because this was a little bit below her, and she formed theatrical companies all over New Zealand. She came here and performed in Dunedin, and when she did, she would usually find a new leading man. In fact, the Foley's marriage didn't last all that long. But she was a formidable lady by all accounts, and would set up her company with one or two professionals, and then she'd use promising amateurs in the settlement to put on the plays. And these were melodramas usually, and farces that she brought out from London, the latest farce or the latest melodrama, and well, it wouldn't be exactly latest because it would take 4 months to get out, and put them on all around the country. And whenever there was a show on with Mrs. Foley, her name would be up there in huge letters. Here's an advertisement for Mrs. Foley performing at the Theatre Royal in Littleton. Just about every theatre was a Theatre Royal in those days. There was one here too. And as you can see there, for the benefit of Mrs. W.H. Foley, in huge writing with exclamation marks following. And then this was what the pattern of entertainment was in those days in the theatre. They don't, like today, we just go to the theatre, we see a play. But in those days, they went for a whole evening's entertainment, which it started off with a melodrama, which was full of melodrama. Baddies and goodies, and a fainting maiden, and who was always Mrs. W.H. Foley, whether it was a young maiden or an old lady, she always had the main part. And then following the melodrama, in this case it was The Hunchback was their melodrama, and it's got all the cast list down there, and Julia is played by, in big capital letters, Mrs. W.H. Foley. And then afterwards, after the melodrama, there was usually a musical interlude, and there would be everyone in the cast had to be able to sing and dance as well as act. So the cast members would do various songs, some of them funny, a lot of them were funny songs, either funny songs where they did it in Irish accent or Scottish accent and danced at the same time, or they were, terribly sad, the dramatic songs of a poor little Maisie who got left out in the snow and never came home, those kind of things. And then following the musical interlude was a farce. In this case it's called Mischief Making. And that was the pattern. The farce was something funny and bawdy and a little bit risque. The same actors doing all three sections. In this case, Mrs. W.H. Foley is playing the part of Therese, a wayward young woman, like all other young women, with a will of her own. I can't even read the last little bit of it, but that was her. So I had to have Mrs. W.H. Foley as a character in my book. I had to have the Foley Circus, and then I read about various other performing families. One of the early performing families was the Buckingham family entertainers. George Buckingham was acting in Auckland, and at one stage with Mrs. W.H. Foley, she came up and said, "We'll do something together," and so they started up a theatre company in Auckland. And as soon as George Buckingham's many children got old enough to perform, he put them on the stage too. They were all hugely talented, the Buckingham family. Here they are. That's the Buckingham family entertainers, just some of them. I mean, he had about 5 more children that were younger than that. But this was George Jr., this was Rosa, this was Conrad, and this was Walter. Or perhaps I've got Walter and Conrad. Anyway, those children could all play the piano, they could sing, they could, I think Conrad played the trumpet, Walter played the flute, George played the flute, and so on. They were very talented kids. Their mother was a pianist, and it seemed to run in families. There were other families that did this whole family entertainment business. And I have this family in my story quite significantly. Rosa Buckingham or Rosetta Buckingham, was their most talented performer, and she had a nasty episode in her life where she got seduced by that villain Bully Hayes, and I don't know whether you've heard of Bully Hayes, but he's a well-known character. So I made Bully Hayes my villain, and I've, as usual, when I'm writing a story, I do this research and I find out all the real characters that I can, but I like to have the main character somebody that I make up myself, or the main 2 or 3 characters, so that I'm a little bit freer to weave a good story. If you take if I wrote the whole story, say, about Rosetta Buckingham, I'd have to write exactly what happened, which could be dramatic, but it gives me a freedom. So my main character in Skylark is Lily Alouette, and she is born in France. When 3 years ago, I was lucky enough to get the Catherine Mansfield Fellowship, which allowed me and Jordan to go and live in the south of France, in Menton, for a whole year, and write in Catherine Mansfield's old room in the villa where she worked too, which was just a magic year. But while I was there, I was writing a book of my novel about Samoa, which seemed odd. Here I was in south of France on the Riviera, writing about Samoa, but that's what I had planned to do, and that's what I did. So I wanted to put something of Menton in a book. So in this book, I've got Lily Alouette growing up in Menton. So Menton, the book starts in Menton, and her family is a family of street entertainers who juggle and do acrobats for the tourists who come down to the Riviera in the summertime. And from there she moves to Australia, to the goldfields, and to New Zealand, and so on. So the whole story is quite melodramatic. So I decided I would make my story a little bit like one of those entertainments. And so that's what my table of contents looks like. It looks like a program. And the first part of the book is a melodrama, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and so on, and the scenes, and so on. It is a story that runs right through from start to finish. And then in the middle of the book, there is, or 2/3 along, is a musical interlude with 2 songs written by this man over there, but they purport to be written by my characters in the. So one of the songs is a sad, melodramatic one, and one is a funny song and clog dance written by Lydia Lysander Lacey, aged 9. It's a song that's meant to have a clog dance with it. A lot of the songs seem to have clog dances going with them, which I'm not quite sure. Somebody here who's a dancer might know. I suspect it was the sort of forerunner of tap dancing, that they danced with clogs and made a good bang on the floor, on the wooden floor of the stage. So, and then the last part of my novel is a farce, in a way. It starts as a farce, but I couldn't keep the farce up, really. but it does have that sort of flavour to it. So I had a lot of fun, I have to say, writing this novel, and I've been quite cheeky with the history of characters, in a way quite cheeky, but everything that happens in the book, or everything that the real characters did, they did do. And the plays that they put on, the places they were at the times they were at, are what really happened. But because I kept thinking, all these women like Mrs. W.H. Foley and the person that Bill Foley, the circus man, took up with afterwards, who was a circus performer herself, there were a lot of women performers who also had a string of kids, and I thought they must have had time off at some stage, but they must have had people who stood in for them at times or pretended they were took stage names. So I've got my Lily standing in for some of the real old characters from time to time, and that's how I managed to weave her in here and there. Another group of family entertainers that I really wanted to get in and have was the Pollard's Lilliputian Operatic Company. They were a little bit later. They were more like the 1880s, so I had to think quite hard how to stitch my story or stretch my story to encompass the 1880s, because the beginning part is in the 1860s, 50s and 60s. But I've managed to do that. And the Pollard's Lilliputian Operatic Company, in fact, their first performance in New Zealand was here in Dunedin, I think. Or was it in Macabre? I think it was Dunedin. I'm pretty sure that's right. And they came from Australia. And Mr. Pollard, and he married and had 12 or was it 14 children. And then his wife died, not surprisingly perhaps, and he married again, had another 3 or 4. And they were all, he was a music teacher, both wives were music teachers, the kids were all talented, and he started up over in Tasmania and then in Melbourne or in Victoria, this little operatic company with all children cast, who put on mainly Gilbert and Sullivan shows, but they did it as little adults. You know, the boys dressed up with moustaches on, little costumes, and the women, the girls wore wigs and beautiful dresses and all that, and they were very highly trained, and the audiences just loved them. They were mostly, the audiences loved them. That when the first performance here, they arrived from a dreadful crossing across the Tasman, and there's a description of them arriving very bedraggled on the wharf here and having to do a show next day or even that very night. But they brought all their costumes and all their scenery with them, and they would audition locally for any talented young kids who were allowed to be in the chorus, because all the main parts were young Pollards, and occasionally there was somebody who could take a main part who was not a Pollard, and as they moved from town to town, they would, or one of the older Pollard boys, who were, all the orchestra were Pollards, and the musical director was a Pollard, and so on. It was amazing family, and somebody would go ahead and train up in the next town some extra chorus kids, but he was very careful about, he wasn't going to pay the locals. They were there for the experience, and they were very lucky to be there, and there was quite a famous, the papers just loved it, a case where a father said, my son was working with you all this time and he should have been paid, and Mr. Pollard said no, he was lucky to be with me, and I'm certainly not paying you. And he brought up a court case of it, but he lost. By the time the court case was finished, Mr. Pollard was off, and the whole company was off up to Christchurch or wherever it was. So, but it was, there were 1 or 2 people who thought this was child labour, and it was dreadful to put kids on the stage night after night. But Mr. Pollard would argue back and say, well, these kids are just learning a trade, just like little kids went into the mines in those days. Little kids started looking for her. In this little bit that I'm going to read, Jack is looking for her. He's heard that she's down in Dunedin. So he comes down looking for her, and she has been seduced by that wretch Willie Hayes, and so Jack wants to rescue, that's what he thinks he's going to do, rescue her. And so he comes, he's been told that maybe Dr. Jones, Dr. Shadrach Jones, might have the answer, because Dr. Shadrach Jones was a famous entrepreneur here in Dunedin. The only picture I've got of him is a Punch cartoon. That's what he looked like. that's what I had to go on to. But he evidently was a very lively man. He was a medical doctor, and he also he's made bankrupt, and he did go bankrupt one time as an entrepreneurship failed him. But he was a medical doctor. He also had a hotel, the provincial hotel, that it was on Stafford Street. That's a drawing of it in the early days. I don't think there is a provincial hotel. Is it still there? Does it look like that stuff? You can kind of have a closer look at it. This is a drawing from the 1860s. And he was also a horse trader, so as part of his establishment there at the provincial, he had out the side, he had a horse bazaar, as they called it, where they sold horses, and he also decided to bring his various people, like the Buckingham family, like Mrs. W.H. Foley and so on, down to perform. So Jack has been told that if he wants to find Lily, maybe he should go and talk to Mr. Jones. So he arrives by boat down from his living up the Wanganui way. The carter leads his horse to the rear of the establishment, this is the provincial, where Jack has asked him to unload, hoping the wares will suit Mr. Jones. Jack himself goes firmly up the front steps into the warmth and order of the hotel. No one is at the desk, but he follows the sounds of hammering and sawing. Here in a large side room, obviously a theatre of some sort, he finds two workmen and a short, plump fellow overseeing them. "I'm looking for a Dr. Jones," says Jack, trying to look his best, but fearing the wet and muddy trip up from the wharf has not spoiled his appearance. "Well, that's me indeed, and at your service," says Jack Jones. He scarcely comes up to Jack's shoulder, but exudes such energy and goodwill that his presence fills the room. "Is it an ailment brings you, or are you after accommodation?" Jones smooths his brightly checked waistcoat, rolls his sleeves back down, rubs his hand through his wildly curling brown hair. "You've caught me at my renovations, but come in, good man, and let's get you dry." Jack has no time to explain his mission, but is bustled into the front parlour and seated before a fire. A maid takes his wet coat and brushes him down, while the proprietor hands him a hot toddy. It's all very pleasant after the long voyage down and the muddy approach. Several other men are sitting in the parlour reading newspapers, or perhaps waiting to board the coach outside. Jones has a word here and there as he brings the drink. "Now," he says, "state your business, for I can see you're a man used to dealing, and yet we've not met, so I assume you are newly arrived. Also," he looks Jack up and down carefully, "I'd say you were a horseman by your clothes, am I right?" Jack has to laugh. He had expected an older, more sober businessman. This Shadrach Jones is like an actor on the stage. He steps this way and that as he speaks, pats at his pockets, curls his moustache, takes out his watch, glances at it, and puts it away again, all the time keeping an eye on the comings and goings in the hotel. He has donned a dark green coat by now over the yellow waistcoat. He's as bright as a parrot and as lively. Jack mentions his load of horse tackle. "Aha, I had you right, no?" Dr. Jones slaps Jack on the shoulder in delight and then frowns. "Pack saddles, eh? The demand is not so strong, but we'll find you a buy, yes we will. Now, I'm a busy man, Mr. Lacey, let us discuss terms." It is not until later, when the business is concluded, that Jack mentions Lily. He uses her stage name, Rosa. The little entrepreneur looks at Jack with narrowed eyes. "Rosa Buckingham? Of course I know her, of course. Such a voice. She performed here with her brothers, in my very theatre. I have to admit, their bill of fare was not to Dunedin's taste." Jones frowns at memory. "Sailed too close to the wind for my clientele. What business have you with her?" Jack stammers an explanation of sorts. Obviously, Shadrach Jones has not been led into the secret. He still believes Rosa was a true sister to the Buckingham boys. "She and I were close friends, more than close. there was an understanding. Suddenly he bursts out, "Dr. Jones, I believe she is being held against her will by Captain William Hayes. I have come to rescue her. She has written asking me to bring her away. I beg you, if you know her whereabouts, to tell me. I feel she's in danger." Shadrach Jones listens with great interest. "Aha! I suspected it. Yes, I did. I suspected as much. Such a lovely lady. Talented, yes. True soprano voice. And yet a beautiful, delightful actress, too. I could not believe she would... well, perhaps I should not say." Jack urges him to go on. Shadrach Jones puts a finger to his lips, draws Jack into a secluded corner of the parlour, pulling a drape to hide them from the other guests. Jack finds it hard to keep a straight face. Surely this little businessman is overdoing the drama. "That talented woman," says Jones in an exaggerated whisper that everyone in the room can hear, "was enthralled to the blackguard Hayes. I'm sure of it, mesmerised by his dark charms. I myself," he throws up his hands in mock despair, "was taken in by him. Yes, I, Dr. Shadrach Jones himself, was fooled. He left my Princess Theatre for the goldfields at the Arrow, taking stage scenery and provisions and 2 of my best horses, all without a penny of payment. Not a penny. Promises, promises, and then finally, by the time I sent the constables to fetch payment, he was gone. I would wager he stole your Rosa with false promises in the same way." Jones glowers. "I have my eye out for that fellow. If he shows so much as a toe in Dunedin, he will be in jail before he takes one breath." He breathes through his nose heavily, then takes out a snow-white handkerchief, shakes it open, and wipes his eyes. A theatrical gesture. "Is she still with him then?" asks Jack, fearing the worst. Jones sighs, shakes his curly head sadly. "I suspect, yes. They were in Riverton briefly last year, too briefly. No sooner had I discovered his whereabouts and sent the bailiffs than he was off again, and again leaving debts, I hear." "Off where?" Shadrach Jones doesn't know, but suggests Jack visit Conrad Buckingham, a brother to Rosa, who is teaching music in Dunedin. That's true, he was. Jack is all for leaving immediately, but Jones will hear nothing of it. "No, no, sir, you must come and see my Princess Theatre first. See where your Rosa performed. It is a stroke of genius. I promise you a horseman will be interested. Come and see." Jack remembers that he might hire a horse from this surprising fellow, and follows the bustling Jones through a side door and into a barn of a hall which is filled with the sounds and smells of horses. Stalls line one end of the vast hall. A large sawdust-covered ring occupies the central section. A handsome bay is being paraded in front of a group of bidders. At the far end, what looks like a construction made from giant boxes is piled to the roof. "My horse bazaar," shouts Jones over the din of auctioneers and buyers doing business, "and also my Princess Theatre." He explains that twice a week he converts the space into a theatre, that the boxes are actually hinged sections of a stage, and behind them are stacked seating and stage scenery, all transformed in 10 minutes precisely. Suddenly we have a beautiful theatre which has hosted the best international talent, the inimitable Thatcher, Annie Vitelli, the Buckinghams, even Mrs. W.H. Foley. Yes, Mrs. Foley. You are right to be surprised, sir, Mrs. Foley herself. Shadrach Jones plants his fists on his lips, beaming. "What do you think of that, sir?" I'll leave it there. Now, I want to invite you to ask questions, but before I do, 2 little things. And one is, I just want to show you something that's off on a different tangent slightly, but something I'm very proud of and pleased. And that is, earlier this year, I was up on Denniston. Denniston's where my Denniston Rose is set, and they have just to launch a Denniston Rose literature trail, which is kind of a first of this sort in New Zealand, and they brought out a brochure, beautiful brochure, and I brought some down. Anyone who's thinking of going up there and or knows of somebody going up there, take one, just take them. I've just brought them to, you don't have to pay them. But it looks like that. It's a self-guided tour, and it opens out into a thing like this. Start here, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 17 different stops that you can go to. And there's little photographs. I help them with there's little excerpts from the book, and you know, like this is where Rose lived, and this is where Con the Great worked, and this is where the Scobie family worked, and so on. So you can see the places where, in my imagination, I set the various things. So it starts at the bottom of the incline and ends up in the graveyard at Waimangaroa, where many of the Denniston people are buried. And there are little signposts all around that have a little rose, a red rose and a heart of coal, a little white post like that. It's a red rose and a heart of coal, number 1, number 2, number 3. So you can follow the whole trail round there, which I was very pleased to think they wanted to do that. And what's more, those of you who are IT savvy or have iPhones or iPads and that sort of thing, at Otago University here, some IT buffs have converted the trail into an iApp, if you know what that means. iApp actually that you can download onto your phone or onto your pad. I'm not sure whether it is being converted for Android yet, but which is the other kind of, you know, not the I, but the Android. And it has got my voice reading little bit excerpts on it, and it's got little video clips of the incline actually working back in the old days, and extra information about Denniston and coal mining and so on. It's beautiful, it's beautifully done. And those guys who did it,